So we're going to continue. Someone asked me actually last night and then again this morning, what makes MGH psychiatry special? And it's sort of what came to mind, sort of resonated with Ellen's comments during following Maggie's presentation, which is in MGH psychiatry, we talk to each other. And I can think of few places where sort of neuropsychologists like Ellen are talking to pediatric psychopharmacologists and other colleagues as we sort of partner to take care of patients. I think that's one of the things that sort of open door and sort of thinking broadly about how we can tailor the most effective treatments for patients, I think is one of the things that really distinguishes MGH psychiatry. And so it's a pleasure now to introduce Ellen Braaten, who is the founding and executive director of the Learning and Education and Assessment program. And she's going to be talking about her new book, Bright Kids Who Could Not Care Less. It's a pleasure to introduce Ellen for her talk.
Thank you, Lee, for that introduction, and I'm so delighted to speak today and would like to start with a huge thank you to the Leadership Council, not just for your tangible support of the work we do, which is significant, but also the enthusiastic emotional support that you provide to so many of us by believing that what we do makes a difference. So not only does your support help our patients, it also helps us on a personal level, so thank you very much. I'd like to share with you some insights I learned while writing and researching my latest book called Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less. And as a way of beginning, I'd like to take you back to 2019. Yes, it's one of those years that seems like yesterday, but also a century ago all at once. Around that time, I'd been noticing a trend in my clinical practice that, for a lack of a better description, we might call unmotivated kids who couldn't care less about the things kids generally do care about. And many of these kids were teens and preteens. You might describe them as the typical kind of like meh adolescent who took meh to the extreme. But some were as young as early elementary school students. And they all voiced a general concern that went something like this. So I'd hear this from a parent: my child is flunking life. Or if it wasn't for video games, my kid would do absolutely nothing at all. Or as a dad from Dorchester said to me, excuse my language, but my child just doesn't give up. And that was actually the working title of the book for a while. I thought this trend might have something to do with the focus of my practice and the kinds of research we do at LEAP. So in 2014, I'd co-written a book with a similar title called Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up, about kids who process and respond to information more slowly than others. And I assumed that maybe what I was seeing was a skewed sample, that the faculty at LEAP had started publishing papers on the association of processing speed and ADHD and learning disabilities and autism spectrum and anxiety. And so maybe kids who had slower processing speed were making up a bigger part of our practice because we had developed somewhat of an expertise in this area. And I thought, well, maybe these kids who couldn't keep up were actually growing up into kids who didn't really care much. But when I looked at the data, what I found was that the issue was much more varied, and that what I was really seeing wasn't a skewed sample, but just the tip of the iceberg. These kids didn't fit into a single category. They weren't just kids who couldn't keep up, or kids who were depressed or anxious or learning disabled or addicted to video games. The problem cut across the spectrum of learning disorders, emotional disorders, and of development. Increasingly, kids were being referred to me who had no discernible problem except for, I just can't get them interested in anything. And then, just as I was beginning to write and research a book about kids who had significant challenges with motivation, 2020 happened. I'm sure you remember this. We all stopped working in offices, and many of you found out you weren't cut out for homeschooling. And of course, many of us also confronted a lot of medical and health challenges and serious losses. And then 2020 happened, and then 2021, which only increased our sense of loss, helplessness, and a who cares attitude for kids and also really for a lot of us too. So this idea I'd had about writing a book about a subset of kids who really didn't care seemed to have a broader audience. So I started by researching what psychology could teach us about motivation. And simply, motivation is really the why we do the things we do. So for example, when we're thirsty, we're motivated to get off the couch and get a glass of water. But even if we're really thirsty, we might not be motivated to get off that couch if we can say to somebody, hey, I'm thirsty, will you get me a glass of water? And somebody does it for us. Now you can think of this kind of metaphorically, but also realistically too. If someone does something for us, we're less motivated to do it for ourselves. We tend to think somewhat that motivation is something that's built into us, like a character trait. And I hear that a lot from parents. I hear a lot from parents, well, I'll never get him interested in anything because he's just like my deadbeat brother. But it's really much more complicated than that. It's affected both positively and negatively by the supports around us. If there's no one around to get us the glass of water when we're thirsty, we don't have any choice but to get it ourselves. So we're motivated to move rather than motivated to ask because there's no one to ask. Now, if there is no water to be had in the house at all, things get more complicated. We might be motivated to call a plumber, or we might feel completely discouraged because it seems too overwhelming and we lose motivation entirely. So Maggie's story today provided a powerful example of how motivation is a complex process. We're not just talking about one thing. Yes, a diagnosis is the start. And it's not, though, just the diagnosis. It's not even just desire or willpower, which Maggie has in spades. It's not even about the perfect treatment. In fact, science has shown us that motivation has a lot of different factors: our biology, our emotions, our thoughts, and the social world in which we live. So I found a few contributing factors underlying this malaise in our youth, and there are the usual suspects that you're probably already thinking of: increased stress, the quest for the right college that starts in preschool in some areas, social media, less sleep, which we should not underestimate as extremely important for mental health, and add to that the emotional effects from the pandemic. Well, when looking at all of these contributing factors, I kind of concluded this one sort of phrase, that I think these days kids have too much pressure and not enough responsibility. So too much pressure, but not enough responsibility. Now, those of us raised decades before may have had too much of the opposite: too little pressure and too much responsibility. We had a lot of freedom without much parental oversight, at least when I think of my own childhood. Older siblings were responsible for taking care of younger siblings, and by a certain age, almost everybody had a summer job, from babysitting to working in your dad's store to mowing lawns. By the time we reached college, we weren't surprised that a lot of college and eventually our careers would include drudgery, hard work, and few rewards. Most kids don't have those experiences these days. They don't have that wonderful feeling that comes from being responsible. And I'm not talking about responsible by getting lots of A's in AP classes. That's pressure. Responsibility is closing out the cash register at the summer ice cream stand. Now, I'm not suggesting we go back to free-range childhoods. In fact, some of the current reasons for parents' behaviors are really valid. The world is competitive, and so is getting into college. As some of you heard from Dr. Colvin today, the pandemic did leave its mark on children's learning, and this is particularly true for students already at risk for educational disparities: students of color, students with disabilities, English learners, and students from low-income households. No, the answers aren't to go back to the past, but to find some of the things that we lost along the way when these childhoods of too much stress and too little responsibility became the norm. So there are three things that I'd like you to think about that I call the Pro Motivation app. Now, it's not a real app. I wish it was. It's just an acronym. And so APP stands for Aptitude, Pleasure, and Practice. Aptitude being the things that we're naturally good at, pleasure being the things that make us happy, and practice being the things we tend to do that give us pleasure. And for kids, it's usually about the things they like to do independently. So rekindling this motivation and kind of jump-starting us post-pandemic really means finding that intersection in our lives between what gives us pleasure, what we like to do, and what we can do. So let's take a look at each one of these things in a little bit more detail. So aptitude, knowing what we're good at doing, is essential for motivation. Again, Maggie talked about that today, that once she knew who she was, it was a lot easier for her to find that motivation. In fact, kids who don't care often experience too little focus on the things they're good at doing. Some of those kids may have ADHD or learning disabilities that go untreated. Think about how different Maggie's life would have been had she not gotten the treatment that she did. At the opposite end are families that I see that are so discouraged by their child's behavior that they have said to me, he's not good at anything. He just can't do anything well. And if you have one of those kids in your life, trying to make things better by telling them they're good at everything also won't work, and it's something we often do when we're feeling helpless. In fact, it can make things worse. The world where everybody gets a trophy or everyone gets the same grade for participating actually are huge demotivators for kids who participated and for the ones who didn't. Now, if you're thinking that when I'm talking about aptitude that it's synonymous with intelligence, you're not wrong. But intelligence is a really narrow view of the incredible attributes that humans are capable of. And so is academic achievement. So I like to think of aptitude as potential ability. And aptitudes are a huge range of things that can be something like honesty, a zest for life, kindness, social intelligence, leadership, humility, humor, and even something like the ability to be a forgiving person. We overvalue intelligence and academic achievement to the exclusion of a lot of these other important qualities that kids who can't care very much often have in spades. And sometimes then seeing the strengths in a child takes loving the child you have, not the child that you wished you had. It might mean loving the child in front of you who's kind and has a wonderful sense of humor, who might never ace calculus. So that's aptitude. Now let's look at the next part of this app, which is pleasure, which should be easy, right? Because pleasure, who doesn't like pleasure? But not really. Our culture isn't really very good at tapping into pleasure. It's one reason why many of us will be going to Italy, the south of France, and Greece this summer, because they have a better idea of what constitutes pleasure. And here's another fact. I found that unmotivated kids are also kids without a lot of pleasure in their lives. They often don't know what they want, and many haven't been happy since life shifted from play to school or from process to product. Now, there are other things that get in the way of pleasure. I mentioned them before: screens, overscheduling, too little sleep again. What are the antidotes? Well, find things that give you pleasure. So many times parents give up the things that we love when we have children, which leaves kids feeling the pressure, not only that we put on them, but also the pressure that comes from them feeling like they have to complete our own happiness. We need to be better examples of how to enjoy life and not just on that 2-week vacation to Italy. Also, we need to talk more about what satisfies kids. What would they do if time and money were no object? We rarely ever have these kinds of conversations with our kids. In fact, I've had many parents say to me, I'm afraid what he'll say if I ask him what makes him happy. That's how afraid we can be of pleasure and of loving the child we have other than the child we wish we had. Other ways to increase pleasure? Well, make sure you have a household where self-sacrifice and hard work aren't the only things that are valued. Cultivate gratitude, because giving to others helps us appreciate our own lives more, and it also helps us focus on what it is that gives us pleasure. We're thankful for things that we like and that we love. And then finally, the last part of this motivation act, practice, might be thought of kind of as a dirty word and bring back bad memories of like clarinet lessons in 5th grade. But practice really is the place where aptitude and pleasure combine into something to do very meaningful in our lives. There's a lot of data that suggests that a little bit of conscious practice goes a long way, and too much time practicing can kill one's enjoyment of almost anything. And that's one of the main reasons why too much homework is rarely ever a positive thing. Now, I started my speech by talking about a time in 2019, and now I want to jump forward to May 2023, just last month. And what seemed like the 100th time a parent asked me, what should my child be doing this summer? Some parents were really eager to enroll their high-achieving students in more AP classes. Others worried that their children with learning differences might need remedial work. A few were worried that if they did nothing, their child would just sit in the basement playing video games all day. And nearly all of them were troubled that their child's academic skills were lagging due to the pandemic. And my answer was, you know what? Try to make summer a place where pleasure and responsibility come together. More AP classes are never the keys to anyone's success. And most adolescents enjoy things like their first jobs. Work is a great source of motivation, and kids spend a lot of time and parents spend a lot of money on tutoring for things like executive function skills when they can learn a lot of those things on the job. The unmotivated adolescent who wasn't as sure about college before working a summer at Dunkin' Donuts often returns to school thinking like, maybe there are other options for adulthood. Same goes for the 6th grader who worked as a summer helper for their neighbor's toddler, and the 4th grader who spent time hanging out at the community pool rather than at a math camp they didn't really need. And this advice about summer, this more responsibility and less pressure, should be expanded into the rest of the year. Kids need time to find what they're good at doing, what they love doing, and what they're willing to spend time doing. It's not just a lack of pressure that's important. Finding the things that motivate us take time. And it's going to be hard for most of us in this room to do, myself included, but we need to have lives where there's plenty of space built into schedules to do nothing much at all. That's when kids are more likely to pick up a book, fiddle with their dad's old bass guitar, or practice hitting a tennis ball against the garage door. These seamless, mindless activities help us find the things that add meaning to our lives. Now, of course, we're not going to solve this with a quick fix or even, unfortunately, with my book, but I do hope you'll find some answers in there. So since we can't immediately solve all of these problems, I'd like to close by answering a question I'm nearly always asked when I give a talk like this. And the question goes something like this. How are we going to solve this huge growing child mental health crisis in our society? Or how can we shorten the wait lists at clinics or increase the number of inpatient beds? It's all so hopeless. And you know what? It is a bit hopeless, but we're not helpless, not at all. And my short answer to this question is going to echo a lot of what Dr. Rausch talked about this morning. And I think the short answer to helping the ongoing mental health crisis is we can, to the best of our ability, surround kids and teens with adults who love kids and teens. And while love is more than enough, having adults in kids' lives who take the time to understand the child's strengths, who demonstrate and help instill a life of pleasure, and who give the child opportunities and the space to spend time practicing, well, that kind of everyday attention to kids' psychological development can go a long way in solving some of the mental health problems that concern us all. So I really do believe that understanding and surrounding kids with people who care about kids is the foundation for hopefulness. And on that note, I want to once again thank departmental leadership and the Leadership Council for surrounding my colleagues and for me with people who support the work that we do, for helping our motivation. So you have my sincere appreciation, and thank you very much.
Stay there.